Hey, and welcome to the Stories Unveiled podcast, where we talk about the purpose in every story and how to live in freedom from your past. I'm your host, Ashley Sears, and each episode you're invited into a conversation about real life between me and a friend. I believe if an issue is addressed in the Bible, then it's important to create a safe and supportive space to discuss it. While some of these conversations are not easy, I do believe they are worth it. If you like what you hear, please visit our ministry at storiesunveiledconference.com. Thank you for joining today. Welcome to our debut episode of the Stories Unveiled podcast. I am Ashley Sears, and I am excited to be here with you. I cannot believe that Stories Unveiled gets to partner with KTSY to bring you incredible stories of hope. I invited a very good friend of mine, Danielle Snelson, to the studio. And we talk about when life doesn't work out the way we want, managing heavy and deep emotions, and how we see God show up in tangible ways through tragic circumstances. Danielle is an entrepreneur, business owner, wife, and mom to a lovely daughter. She has lived in Boise, Idaho for almost 23 years and enjoys being outdoors with her dogs, traveling, and spending quality time with her people. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, welcome, Danielle. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we are talking about disappointment. We're just going to jump right in, and we're going to talk about what happens when our life's plans do not match God's plans for our life. So I'm just going to ask you to kick right off and tell me the very first time as an adult that you experienced some major disappointment.
Yeah. I think about being a young girl and a young woman and being so excited to get married and move away and start a new life with someone. And, everything that we are told growing up from our moms or Disney or whoever, tells us that getting married is happily ever after. You're going to move into the big castle and have lots of babies and be so happy, right? And I just remember the first month of being married, and I was like, what did I just do?
Wasn't quite what you signed up for?
It was not what I signed up for. And it was just a really big, scary letdown, I think, because you get into a situation and you're like, whoa, this isn't, two people coming together and doing life together. And you realize, oh, I didn't ask all the right questions, or I didn't know to talk about that, or I didn't know this is what life looks like, on the other side of marriage. And so it just, for me, adjusting to married life and learning to stand up for myself was a new adventure.
Yeah, we get married and to become one, but we don't always know how to do that, right?
No, and I don't know if marriage counseling really prepares us for all of those things.
Not for the real life. Not a lot of times. No, you're right.
And it's more than just, oh, you're using my toothbrush, which is gross.
Yeah. Well, and marriage is really hard. Everybody says that. Everybody says, oh, marriage is so hard. But, hard is different for everybody. And so there are some really different levels of hard. And sometimes it is just you're using my toothbrush or you left your clothes on the floor. And I hate that. But sometimes it's much bigger things that kind of like we'll talk about in your story in just a minute. Okay, so you got married. It was not everything you were anticipating. It was hard, and you were adjusting. And then what happened? You have a beautiful daughter, right?
I do. Those first couple months of marriage, I was done. I wanted out. But then I got pregnant.
Yes.
And it was a blessing in disguise because I didn't leave. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things go through your mind when you're pregnant and you don't know what to do in your marriage and you don't know what to expect and it's not what you wanted. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is not the life that I wanted. And the first 3 months of being pregnant, I was like, this is ruining my life. So many different emotions and experiences around being pregnant. And I got married young. For me, I felt young. I was 23 years old, and now just getting married, and we moved to California away from all of our family, and then I find myself pregnant a few months later going, what is happening?
You felt your life was falling apart?
It did. It really felt like my life was falling apart. But just going through that, I mean, fast forward, our daughter's born and we're still kind of struggling in our marriage, but it was helping our marriage. And so there was tiny little things that kept progressing and changing and getting better that I was like, okay, I can do this as long as we're moving forward in the right direction, and essentially bringing God into the middle of our marriage is what kept it together. Not the baby. It was God.
It was God. I was going to say having a baby doesn't usually make a marriage better. At least I know that from my experience.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask, what was your plan for your life? So you got married young, you had a kid very early, was not expecting how life was starting to shape up. You moved away and were in California. What was kind of your vision for your life?
Oh my gosh, I wanted the California surf life and go snowboarding, on the weekends. And my husband was working in pro sports, so it was just, there was a lot of travel going on. And so I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to get married and travel and go to the beach all the time and go surfing and just essentially like do whatever I wanted.
Okay.
So maybe it's not a specific plan that I had for myself. It's just the idea of being able to just like be an adult and be by myself, or not by myself, but
pick up and go
and
we
just kind of like be free. And I felt trapped.
Okay. That's a really good way an analogy. So you started a business at some point in there, and I think that your living situation changed at some point. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was back in 2008. The economy was going down. We were living in California, just had a baby, and we realized my husband was losing his job, I was losing my job, and we couldn't afford to live there anymore. Mm-hmm. And we had support back in, Boise, Idaho. And my husband decided, I should say that because I still give him a hard time about it today. He decided we're going to pick up and move. We're going to go back home. And we ended up moving in with my parents, which was another big disappointment because, again, you're like, wow, I'm supposed to be married. I'm supposed to be an adult. I'm supposed to be taking care of myself and my life and have it all together. And everything just kept falling apart. And so we were, living with my parents for a little bit, and I was looking for a job. And there, my daughter was 1 at the time, and I wanted something in the events industry, which is where I'd come from. But I couldn't find anything that was flexible enough because I wanted to be able to be home. And, this world of remote didn't exist back then like it does today. Right. And so I decided to start my own business. We were in debt. We were living with my parents. I figured, what else do I have to lose? So that's how it got started.
Okay. So what was your husband doing at the time?
He had gotten a gig working with some professional athletes, but he had to leave for a few months to go work with someone in Washington. So I kind of got stuck by myself during this period of time.
Okay. And still living with your parents? Still
living with my mom and dad.
And your baby?
Yep.
And that is probably the one thing I know I always pushed up against. As soon as I got married, it was like, I will never move back home. I will never move back home with my parents. I have kids. Like, we have this idea of we're adulting, right? And so we have to be married and have it all together and not be in debt and have a good job and support our kids. And the reality of it is while my husband and I never moved home and we never moved back in with our parents, we did live off of russet potatoes and ramen like a lot when we were raising our kids.
Yeah.
And that's hard. So
that is hard.
I understand kind of swallowing your pride and having to move in with parents is not ideal and definitely not a plan for our life. So that's going to take us to kind of a big event that I wanted to bring up. I believe it was 2014.
Yeah.
Is that correct? So something huge rocked your entire family's world in January of 2014. Will you tell us all about that?
Yeah. I felt like going through starting a business with nothing, kind of getting back on our feet, reestablishing our life. It felt like we were finally getting there.
Yeah.
We had our own place. We were doing our things. Like the business was working. And it felt like I was finally able to start having some of that freedom.
That your plan was maybe finally aligning with God's plan. Like, okay, God's got this. It's fine.
Yes.
We're moving forward. We're out of my parents.
Yeah.
Okay. And things are going well.
And my husband and I just had a really great trip together. I think we had just celebrated 7 years of marriage, and we were making this joke about the 7-year itch, right?
Yeah.
And that we were just having a really good time, and it's actually a really great year for us. And then my husband got in a really bad dirt bike accident. Mm-hmm. And he landed himself in the hospital with a broken spine, broken back. He broke his, I don't know what it's called, some hip thing.
Okay.
Punctured his lungs, dislocated his shoulder. He was super beat up, had one working limb. And it rocked our world.
Mm-hmm. Now, kind of fast forwarding, but what was the result of that? Because he's not okay, right? I mean, he's alive.
Yeah.
But what did that result in?
A lot of recovery, a lot of bills, a lot of, challenge. There was just so many things. I'm trying to articulate it so that it's not overwhelming or confusing. But during this time, we didn't purchase a home. We were renting. And so now we had to buy a house, and both of us are two self-employed people. So a mortgage is feels impossible.
Yeah.
And navigating not only the circumstances of my husband being in the hospital with some very major injuries as well as recovery, putting together, mortgage papers. We're signing documents in the hospital just to have his signature because I can't sign for him. And then finding a house in a very intense market where everything's flying off the shelves, and doing this all from a hospital room, and trying to understand and navigate what he's going to need in a wheelchair. I never thought about what somebody in a wheelchair, let alone being paralyzed, is going to need it at their home. How do they take a shower? How does that work? How do they get from point A to point B? How do they get dressed? What kind of space do they need?
Yeah.
The floors, no carpet. So we had to remodel so many different aspects of our home. It's kind of sight unseen, not knowing what he's going to need, trying to buy a house, get the mortgage, remodel a house. My daughter's 5 at the time, so taking care of making sure she's getting ready for kindergarten and has everything she needs. And I'm running a business, making sure money's still coming in, and all of those different things. And so it was just a very overwhelming, very intense time in our life.
So you had to move because you were renting, and your husband ended up paralyzed. And you knew that leaving the hospital, he was going to be in a wheelchair. He was not going to use his legs again.
Yeah.
And you couldn't renovate a rental. And it's probably not ADA, up to date or whatever, and probably has one step or a porch that he couldn't get up and down. I mean, you don't think about, it's just a 1-story house, but that's not even necessarily the case, right? It's the width between counters and bathroom and all of those things. And so you went from having a competitive athlete as a husband to a paraplegic overnight, not even overnight, in an instant.
Yeah.
And Danielle, I cannot even imagine, because I've bought a couple houses, and looking at them and deciding what's going to work for your family and the costs and signing papers is one of the most tedious experiences that I've ever gone through. And especially in a crazy market, I can't even imagine doing all of that from a hospital. But tell us about your role in this. So we won't primarily talk about your husband's accident because that's your husband's story.
Yeah.
Although you had a really, really large part in the recovery side of things and in picking up the pieces and the fallout of that. I will say, I remember, Danielle, you have spoken at one of the events that Stories Unveiled has done. You did that 5 years ago, and you shared a similar story, but you did talk a lot about the fallout of this and what we're about to talk about. And when I asked you to share, you said, well, no one has ever asked me to share because that's not my story. That's Jed's story, Jed, your husband. And I said, but man, how were you not affected? Like you have such a story in this. And so talk about disappointment and not thinking that your life was going the way you had planned. So tell me about the accident happened, you're in the hospital, and now what? I can imagine you were obviously scared and upset. Were you ever angry at God?
All the time. I was mad because I felt like I was just starting to get my life back, and now it was taken away again, it felt like. Mm-hmm. And, you go through a lot of like different emotions around, especially being a Christian and a believer. And it's like, how is this supposed to be for my good? I don't understand.
Yeah, the Bible says it is, but I don't see it.
And, I look back at a moment too, where the day I found out about him being in the hospital, I was 2 hours away in the mountains, and I was just helping a friend. She was planning a wedding, and the next day, it was a Sunday because we were doing cleanup. Mm-hmm. And I remember having this feeling of like, I got to go home. I need to be with my family. Like this like overwhelming feeling of like, I just got to go home. And this is not like me. This is not my personality to just be like, I don't feel like cleaning up. Have fun. Bye. And, I told my friend, I said, I have to go home. Something's not right. I just need to go. She's like, great, go. Like, it's all good.
And you didn't know?
I had no idea. And I know that God was watching out for me because it's a 2-hour drive through the mountains. And some of the scariest roads I find, because it's like road and then like canyon with like river.
Okay. Yeah.
No guardrails, no nothing. And I think, man, had I have known before I got into that canyon where there's no cell service. So it's, I was just listening to music probably. And had I have known, I'm like, I don't know if I could have driven myself home. I would have been so upset.
Yeah.
And I think about like that moment of God had his hands on me and was protecting me through something that I didn't know I was
about to walk into.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That moment always gets me.
That's okay.
Every time. But I think as mad as I was, that moment stuck with me because I knew he was with me.
Yeah.
Whether I wanted to admit that it was like, it's not happy,
right.
But I knew he was with me. And I think that feeling helped me through those months after of it's okay.
Yeah. So tell me about just like the recovery process, not your husband's recovery, but what did that look like for you? You had a daughter starting kindergarten or was in kindergarten because I guess this was January. And you were in the process of a house or had just gotten a house. And I think there were some remodels that needed to take place in that new house. And like, how long was your husband in the hospital? And did you ever have a moment where you just were like, why God? Like something's got to give. Just tell me about that.
Yeah, my husband was in the hospital, like formal hospital, for a good couple of months.
Okay.
And then he moved into a recovery facility where he was learning to dress himself, go to the bathroom, occupational therapy type stuff. And so, if I remember right, it was at least a total of like 5 or 6 months that he hadn't been home.
Wow.
And so during all of that time, like I was at home and kind of running the house, running the projects, running the daughter. And I had family in town too. So they would come and they would help and they would do a lot of like things for my daughter just to help keep things normal, but also to help me with a remodel and things as basic as like we had to paint the walls in this new house, and I just couldn't even make that decision. I was like, I don't even know what color gray I want.
Yeah.
And
somehow it may even seem like it pales in comparison to what's going on. Like you knew you needed to paint the walls, but like...
Because they were this weird pink and like everywhere. And I knew I didn't want that, but I was like, I can't even make a decision over paint, you know?
Yeah.
It just felt so overwhelming. And I actually remember the paint. I would just start crying. I was like, I don't know. It felt like this big life decision that I was going to live with the color gray for the rest of my life, and I just couldn't figure it out.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of like those types of moments of just crying in the shower and asking why, like, why God, why is this happening to us? Like, why?
Yeah.
And, you know, there was therapy involved for me to be able to process like what the feelings I was going through. And so that was really helpful to help manage my own emotions, but also to help my daughter manage her emotions. She was going through a lot too. And at 5, that's a really scary experience to walk along and not totally understand it necessarily, but she had a lot of feelings around it. So that was a lot of healing for me, is just crying, taking it a day at a time, trying my hardest to trust that it was for a bigger purpose, that God was with us, that he wasn't, you know, we didn't do something to deserve this.
Yeah.
But yeah, and we had a really strong church family. So like that was huge. It was huge.
I didn't know you guys when it happened. I had actually just met your husband maybe a week prior, and I was actually working. I was working at the church that you guys were attending, and I remember hearing that one of our congregation members, Danielle Snelson, had just been in a terrible accident, and I actually hung out with your daughter all afternoon and evening because we had a kids event. I remember that evening, and I actually was able to hang out with her, and I had never met her, didn't know her, and so it's actually just funny how all these years later, how good of friends we are. But during this time, was there ever a moment where God just revealed himself to you and showed up? And whether it was during this accident or lots of other times, whether it was moving to Boise, starting this, you know, job on your own to be able to stay home with your daughter, any of these things, where did God show up? I mean, God's always with us, but where did you see him really become tangible for you?
I think the very first time, because I was really upset about the move. I didn't want to leave California.
Yeah.
And I remember going for a run one day, and I just was like, maybe I should start my own business and, you know, all of these different things. And it felt irresponsible. And I remember being out on a run, and I was just like running, praying, listening to music, you know, all the things. And like, I felt just God like radiate through me and was like, this is what you're supposed to do. And this is why you're here. And in that moment, I accepted the fact that we moved back home, and it felt defeating. But then I realized, like, now I look back and I go, oh, that was on purpose. There was no way I was going to be starting an event business in Southern California. I mean, It's so competitive. I had no network. I had nothing, right? And so many doors were able to open for me in opening my own business because I took that leap and because we moved. And so seeing that in hindsight, I realized I was like, God was directing us, especially my husband, for making the decision that we were leaving. But then he was putting us in a place that I could thrive with a business and be the mom that I wanted to be. And so that was like the first major, I think, moment. The second major moment was in the car ride coming through the mountains on the way back, where I just was like, I felt so protected. And then another moment that happened for us was when we were in the hospital, and it was weeks, maybe a week.
Okay. So
after the accident. I had been living at the hospital. I hadn't left. I might have taken a shower. I have no idea.
Oh man.
And I remember I remember praying, and it's like sometimes you're like, God, I'm just going to open my Bible and like
show me something.
Show me
you're real.
Like we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
And I think this moment he actually did.
Yeah.
And so he gave me this verse, and I'm going to read it. Is it okay if I read it?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I'm going to preface this with I hated this verse because it made me so mad that I was like, are you serious? That's what you just, this is what you're telling me? Anyway, I still think I get upset about it sometimes. Philippians 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. It still tears me up. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And I was so mad. I was like, why are you telling me to rejoice? I just want to scream. I want to be mad. Why can't I just be mad?
Right.
But this verse, every time, like I knew it was from him. He gave it to me, in this moment. And it's just something I look back on. And I think about all the times I did get to rejoice. I got to rejoice over how many people helped us, supported us, gave us money, helped me with the house, helped me with my daughter. I got to rejoice that my husband didn't die.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was close to it.
Yeah, he was.
And now today I look back and I get to rejoice at so many more things that has happened in our life. And it's been, how many years now? What did we say? 8.5?
Almost 9. Yeah, it'll be 9 years in January.
And 9 years of things that wouldn't have been possible in our lives had, my husband not been in this accident. And I just want to like connect a dot here. And I don't even know if we've ever talked about this specifically, actually. When I first got married and I was having that moment about like, what did I get myself into?
Yeah.
Right. I felt like I married the biggest jerk in the world. And he knows this, so this is not new if he's listening. And after the accident, somebody had said, like, how's marriage? And like, how is that going for you guys? And I said, I finally got the husband I always wanted. I just didn't know he'd be in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And it has changed his heart and who he is. And like, gosh, I have this amazing man that makes me happy and smile all the time. And like, we just have such a strong connection and a strong marriage and a strong family life now that without like, rejoice always. And so I have so much to rejoice about when at the beginning I thought, this is going nowhere.
You wanted to leave and you didn't realize that, fast forwarding, obviously working through and seeing progress and little things here and there, but you didn't know that it wasn't necessarily marriage counseling or all of these things. It was a traumatic event that landed your husband in a wheelchair that changed your marriage.
Yeah.
And nobody would pray for that. Nobody would pray for, but if your prayers in your marriage are either Lord, change my husband, or Lord, change me, or help my marriage, or whatever it is, nobody would ever jump to thinking, well, it would have to be something tragic like this. And so obviously you would be so angry and so upset, like, really, Lord, one more thing?
Yeah.
But wow, how amazing that, just like you said in the Bible, what good are you going to use this for, God? Well, that, like, your marriage is so good now. Now, not to say that it's still not a typical marriage. We don't ever want to fool anybody into thinking that your marriage is perfect.
We still have lots to work on.
Yeah. But it was actually such a blessing. That's something so tragic and seemingly terrible, absolutely terrible, that God has turned it around for good, and that your marriage is thriving now because of it. I do want to ask you one last thing. For the person that's listening to this, who maybe does not have this experience, maybe it's not their marriage, maybe it's not their husband being in an accident or something so specific, but for somebody listening who feels like their life is not going the way that they wanted and they just continue to feel let down, beat down, discouraged, what would you say to them? I know that's a hard question.
It is a hard question. And it's not just as simple as have hope or trust or believe. Those things are important.
Totally.
Because I felt like I was faking hope and belief. And sometimes I felt like my prayers were not fake, but I was just like going through the motions, saying what I thought I would needed to say.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to say just trust the process.
Yeah.
Because it's so much harder than that. But I also now looking back, I can say with truth in my heart to believe that God is with us and he wants good for us. And that even though something feels so terrible and it's not what we want, because I'm pretty stubborn. I want what I want. And if I don't get it, I pout. That is me.
Yeah.
But trusting that God's vision for our lives is so much greater than anything we could ever imagine for ourselves. To the point that even in my own business, it's taken me 15 years to finally get what I want out of it. And I think about the time, how much patience is required, how much time is required, because I couldn't have what I have today had I have not gone through all the things that I've gone through to prepare me to be ready to receive what God actually wants for me in my life. Yeah. And I think that that's so important, but that perspective is really hard when you're in it.
Yeah.
So I feel like if someone is feeling in it right now, to hold on, just to hold on, to keep believing that God's got it and that his vision for you is what you're meant to go through.
Right.
It's not a surprise to him that my husband got in an accident and that we had to go through all of this stuff in our marriage and blah, 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 and all the things that were so hard. He was preparing us for what it is that was to come. And now I see it. I see it. And now I feel like I can trust that process in a bigger sense because I've gone through it. I mean, there's probably more coming our way of some kind, so it's not over.
As it always is. But to trust that his plan is bigger, that's, I think, huge, because your story is not wrapped in a pretty bow.
And we still deal with it every day.
Your husband is still paralyzed. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, your husband is still paralyzed. He's still dealing with the fallout of it, whether it's the daily things of getting things above the fridge that he's got to yell for you or your daughter to get, or he still can't do certain things or finds great difficulty doing certain things. And that is just your life, your guys' life moving forward. And so God didn't give him his legs back, but because because you two are being obedient and following Jesus and putting him at the center, you are able to see kind of the beauty of what God has for you come to fruition. And now I'm assuming, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that when God throws things your way, or life, I guess I should say, throws things your way, that you are able to just trust God's got this because he has a bigger plan, because I've already seen him do amazing things.
That's exactly essentially the meditation I think about every day.
Yeah.
Because it's a daily choice to wake up and believe that.
Yeah.
And so, yes, what you're saying is correct, but it's not just as easy as oh, this is easy now. I've got this, right?
Yeah.
It's the daily choice to wake up and believe that every day.
Yeah.
Because it's hard every day.
To consciously make that decision, I'm going to believe this today.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle. I really appreciate your vulnerability and just sharing your story about your family and just being real and having a real conversation, because I think it's so important to just talk about the real life things. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here with me. And
thanks for letting me share.
of course. Thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation on the Stories Unveiled podcast. We would love it if you would leave us a rating or review. If you would like to learn more about Stories Unveiled and our events, go to storiesunveiledconference.com or follow us on Facebook or Instagram at storiesunveiled_. The Stories Unveiled podcast is created in partnership with KTSY and Barefoot Media Ministries. For more encouragement and other podcasts, visit ktsy.org. Have an incredible day and go live unveiled.